Scholars tell us that it was probably Barnabas who was Paul's mentor, or it might have been the great orator Apollos who wrote the book of Hebrews and the words that we just read. We know that whether it was Barnabas or whether it was Apollos who wrote these words, we know where they were directed. They were directed to the Hebrew converts to the Christian faith who were living around Rome. And so because the audience were Hebrew background people, the writer takes great pains to give them examples of Hebrew faith. And so he mentions people that these Hebrews would know about, people like King David and Samson and Jephthah and the great prophet Samuel. So he reminds them about faith that these people displayed when they were alive. He's basically telling them that their example of faith can still empower them as they now live as Christians around Rome. He wants them to know that because of their faith, these ancestors, their walk, although difficult, is made just a little bit easier because of those who came before them. Now, in much the same way, we here at First Baptist Church, our walk has been made a little bit easier because of the faith of those who came before us. People like Colonel Samuel Phoenix and his brother Henry Phoenix. These were businessmen, successful businessmen, merchants in the state of New York. But they weren't happy living in New York. They wanted to establish a Christian community out west. And so what these two men of faith did was they sold their businesses, packed up their families, and they moved west. They purchased property west of Lake Michigan. And they settled there. They built the first two homes in a little establishment that they would call Delaware. They were Baptists. And so when they came here, they gave thanks to God for a safe trip. And they came here with the hope and the goal to establish a temperance colony. A colony that would be free from alcohol. They also were very clear that they wanted to establish in this colony an anti-slavery posture. And so the Phoenix brothers came, settled here. And they were soon joined by other Baptists out east who wanted to come and be in this kind of an environment out in this new world. Every Sunday, Samuel would open up his home for those Baptists in the area to come worship and study the Bible. And so after founding this place in 1836, 3 years later, there were about 17 Baptists who were faithfully gathering in Samuel's home for worship and Bible study. These 17 Baptists in 1839 decided that they would form the first congregation, a Baptist congregation. Their gathering for worship, their decision to form a congregation, which officially took place in the home of another very important man, William Bartlett, in the life of this church. And so they gathered in Bartlett's home and organized and became a church. 1839. It was an act of faith that is still blessing us today. Amen?
Amen.
But this little congregation did more than just establish themselves. They went on record, as Greg alluded to earlier, by making two very public, bold announcements. Let me read to you their declaration as a congregation of 17 members. The use of alcohol is unwise, for it will lead to much evil. And slavery is an institution in opposition to the law of God and the advancement of God's kingdom. First congregation in the territory of Wisconsin to make those two bold statements. And I tell you, they were bold statements given the time period that they were living in. But they made those statements because of their faith. See that? Samuel Wesley went even further. And he was very, very vocal against slavery. And he would be quoted as saying this: "The curse of the Lord will rest upon the American church," all denominations present in the country at that time, "for their complicity with the giant sin of slavery." Very provocative statement by Samuel at that time. But it was a statement of faith that made a difference eventually in the life of our country. After worshiping for 1 month as a new congregation, they worshiped 1 month as a new congregation without a pastor, the congregation decided to do something else, to call their very first pastor. That was an act of faith in this tiny little congregation of now 22 members. Because if you're going to call a pastor, you've got to be able to support that pastor, and that means the giving of your tithes and your offerings. And there was a shortage of tithes and offerings in this new little community. But that congregation of 22 members, because of their faith, made that decision. It was helped, I admit, by the Phoenix brothers, who said that they would pay 2/3 of the new pastor's $300 a year salary. So Reverend Henry Todd was called. Right over there. Very first picture. He was a man of vision. A man who really wanted to share Christ with others and who wanted others to invite Christ. He was a man of faith. Through his faith and his vision, the congregation grew from 22 members to 172 members. Through his faith and his vision, the congregation decided to build a meeting house. That's what it was called in those days. On land given by the Phoenix brothers, right here in this site. Picture of that meeting house is out there in that entryway. The year was 1841. 2 years after they became a church, they built their first meeting house, very first Baptist meeting house in the territory of Wisconsin. And with his faith and his leadership and vision, Reverend Topping and this congregation, as Greg alluded to, established 7 other Baptist churches in this area, in Walworth County and in Rock County. So this congregation intentionally founded 7 other Baptist churches. These churches weren't started by splintering groups who were dissatisfied. Please hear that, because sometimes churches get started that way. But no, this congregation was intentional in founding these other faith communities. Faith. And there's one other thing that you need to know. Maybe some of you know this. But it really, really impressed me about Reverend Reverend Henry Todd. He invited a preacher, John Dudley, to come from out east to do some guest preaching here. And Todd sat back and he watched Dudley interact with the congregation. He listened to the sermons that Dudley was preaching, and Todd sat back and he realized that Reverend John Dudley was extremely gifted as a pastor and preacher. He realized that Dudley's gifts and graces exceeded his own. Now listen closely. Reverend Tom prayerfully, I'm sure prayerfully, made a decision. It was a sacrificial decision based on faith. Reverend Topping decided that if the church was going to grow more so, he should resign as pastor. And so he did. He resigned as the pastor of this church, and they were shocked, I'm sure, because with him they had much success. And Topping said, I'm resigning, but you need to call Reverend John Dudley as your next pastor, because he can take you farther than I can take you. Sacrifice. Faith. I don't know of too many pastors that would make that decision, voluntarily resign to hire someone else. Reverend Henry Topping did. And because of this sacrifice, because of this faith, the church grew in ways that the church would not have grown if Reverend Topping had remained pastor. We're empowered in many, many ways by the faith of those who have come before us. Like the Phoenix brothers, like William Barber, like Pastor Topping, Pastor Doug. But lest you think that men were the only ones who helped shape this congregation, let me quickly remind you that there were some powerful women who also helped to shape this congregation. And I shared with the children Nettie Lau, who for years blessed this congregation with her youth work, teaching Sunday school. She wasn't alone, though. She had another woman whose name was Belle Tennant. And she worked right alongside Nettie for years. Her picture's also up here. That was part of the pictures that I showed the children. So Belle Tennant and Nettie Lau, through their faith, through their sharing, their care, compassion, influenced this church. And then, of course, there was Susan Aaron. She, through her faith, influenced this church, especially through her generosity. When Susan gave the money to the church in 1902 to build the Aram Parlor, which now bears her name, she made this statement. I have been a member of this church for 62 years, and I hope and pray that God's blessing of God may rest upon this church and community. And when congregations break up in this world, may we all be so happy as to someday meet in the upper world where congregations ne'er break up and Sabbaths never end. Statement of faith. We have been blessed by those who have come before us. But it's our responsibility now to be a blessing to those who will come after us. The faith of countless number of people, the pastors that surround us today, the lay people that you see in Fellowship Hall, their faith brought us to this point, 175 years. It will be your faith that will determine if this church moves on for another 25 years or more. It's our responsibility to grow this church in membership and in worship attendance. By inviting others. It's the way it's done. By sharing our stories about how God and church has made a difference in our life. And if you come, maybe God can make a difference in your life. No, maybe, actually, God will. But to do that inviting and sharing, takes faith. It's our responsibility to maintain this church by giving of our tithes and our offerings and growing in our time. But to do that, it will take faith. It's our responsibility to make sure there's Christian education, Sunday school for our young people, Bible studies for our older people, video studies, so that people can come and learn in more in-depth ways about God and the faith. But it will take faith on our parts to make sure this happens, to make sure that people come if a Bible study is offered or a video study. It's our responsibility to make sure that this church continues to reach out in mission, like our ancestors did. For when we reach out in mission, we make a difference in life, right? Amen? And also, when we reach out in mission, we communicate to those outside these walls that this church is alive and is doing something and making a difference here in Delta. But it'll take faith on our parts to make sure that happens. Faith brought us here. Now, it's up to us. To each one of us in our own way, getting involved, doing something, showing faith. That will determine if we move on. What ways can you get involved and show your faith?